On a frozen fjord in the far north, where wind carries the taste of salt and ice, a slab of granite once stood, its surface marked with a weathered cross. Local villagers called it the Stone of the Whispering King, as though it remembered voices long gone. To some, it was nothing more than rock shaped by centuries of frost. To others, it was a question carved in silence. Could the blood of the old Frankish kings, the long-haired Merovingians, have found refuge here, hidden beneath northern snow? From that question stretches a trail of symbols and whispers. Bees, gleaming in a forgotten tomb, roses blooming in glass and stone, spirals etched into swords and beams of timber churches. There are prophecies scribbled in margins, fleets said to vanish into mist, and graves that hum with both Nordic and foreign echoes. None of these fragments gives certainty, but together they form a riddle that tolls like a distant bell, inviting us to listen, to wonder, and perhaps to drift a little deeper into the mist of history. This is Serene Myths, a place where stories unfold slowly, where history becomes a lullaby. If you enjoy journeys like this, you're welcome to like or subscribe, and share in the comments where and when you find yourself listening tonight. So let us begin on that frozen fjord with the whispering stone and the first toll of the bell. The air of the far north carries a silence that is unlike anywhere else. It is not the hush of a quiet library or the pause before dawn in a city, but something more ancient, as though the earth itself has held its breath for centuries. On a frozen fjord, where the mist hangs low and the water beneath creaks with a slow rhythm, a granite slab juts from the ground half swallowed by ice. Local fishermen call it the Stone of the Whispering King. They say that when the wind blows just right across its carved face, the grooves of the symbol etch their hum like a ghostly bell. On its surface, time-worn and almost erased, lies a cross unlike the simple ones that adorn northern churches. This one bears a curious style, more akin to the flared crosses that the Knights Templar once carried upon their white cloaks. The factual record reminds us that Scandinavia, from the Viking Age into the late Middle Ages, was a patchwork of faiths and encounters. Wooden churches were raised where long houses had once stood, and Christian crosses mingled with solar wheels and dragon heads. Archaeologists have cataloged dozens of stones in Norway and Sweden bearing Christian carvings that date as early as the 10th century, blending northern runes with the marks of the cross. In that light, this granite slab with its half-buried cross could belong to that transitional world of belief. Yet its strange proportions invite a second glance, a wondering if it was meant as a beacon of something other, perhaps something carried northward from lands far beyond the fjord. What makes the tale stranger is the name the locals gave it, the Stone of the Whispering King. The nickname itself is not old in the sense of medieval chronicles. It seems to appear first in travel notes from the 19th century, when a Danish schoolmaster recorded stories he had heard on a winter journey. He claimed that the villagers believed the stone spoke on certain nights, not in words, but in vibrations that traveled through the ice, as though someone crowned long ago still murmured beneath the surface. One might dismiss this as folklore, a poetic flourish for a stone too ordinary otherwise to deserve mention. Yet that name, once spoken, clings stubbornly to the imagination. The debated point lies in whether this whispering stone, this peculiar cross, has any real tie to the vanished dynasty of the Merovingians. Historians agree that the Merovingian kings of the Franks, who ruled parts of what is now France and Germany from the 5th to the 8th centuries, had no official ventures into Scandinavia. Their chronicles concern battles with Visigoths, Burgundians, and Saxons, not voyages into Arctic waters. Still, speculative historians suggest that exiles or remnants, driven northward in later centuries, could have carried their symbols with them, leaving faint traces in wood, stone, and story. The connection is tenuous at best, more an echo than an inscription. But echoes are sometimes what endure longest in the night air. Imagine the scene. A traveler standing before the granite, torch in hand. Snow drifting into the grooves of the ancient cross. The steel edge of the wind rattles the fir trees nearby. Bells from a far-off chapel might faintly carry across the fjord if one listened hard enough. It is not difficult to let the mind wander to another time, to knights fleeing the fury of kings, or monks carrying a bundle of manuscripts northward across the sea. Symbols, once carved into stone, outlast their owners. They wait for strangers centuries later to lean close and ask, "What story is hidden here?" A peculiar twist in the tale comes from how the stone aligns with the landscape. On the shortest day of the year, when the sun barely crawls above the horizon, its light falls directly across the cross, making the carved lines glow faintly before sinking again into shadow. Was this intentional? Could an anonymous mason in the late Middle Ages have meant it as a signal, a reminder, or simply a decoration placed without cosmic thought? Archaeologists note many stones in Scandinavia positioned with respect to the solstices, suggesting at least some awareness of light and season. Whether this one carries such a purpose remains unresolved, but the alignment adds to its aura, a touch of deliberate mystery in the frozen air. And so, the stone becomes more than rock. It becomes a threshold into questions of lineage and legacy. The Merovingian kings, those long-haired kings who bound their authority in strands of hair never to be cut, faded officially when Pepin the Short seized power in 751 with the blessing of the Pope. Yet rumors clung to their memory, whispering that their bloodline did not vanish, only withdrew, waiting somewhere in silence. Could that silence have stretched all the way to the fjords of Norway, where a fisherman centuries later would place his ear to the ice and swear he heard a voice? It is easy, at this point, to feel the tug between skepticism and enchantment. The historian within insists on context. Crosses in Scandinavia are not rare. Stones acquire nicknames all the time, and folktales expand like snowdrifts when the wind is strong. But the dreamer within lingers on the idea of a royal exile, a lineage hidden, a story entrusted to granite rather than parchment. Between fact and speculation lies a fertile mist, where bells toll faintly and forests listen. In the hush of that northern fjord, the stone and its cross remain. The whispers may be only the sound of wind funneling through the cracks. The king may never have existed beyond imagination. But perhaps the value of the tale is not in proving its reality, but in sensing the echo it creates. The steel of history can be cold, sharp, unforgiving, but the mist softens its edges, and the forest absorbs its ringing into something like music. And so, as we stand before the Whispering King's stone, we step into a story that may lead us deeper into legend. From this frozen beginning, we follow the thread southward, into courts and chapels, into the long hair of monarchs and the ink of chronicles. But for now, the stone waits in its silence, keeping watch beside the icy water. The question remains, who first carved the cross upon its surface? And why did they choose this lonely northern fjord? That question opens the path into our next Childeric chapter, where the long-haired kings of the Franks stride across the stage of history, their crowns heavy with both steel and myth. The story of the Merovingians begins, as many great dynasties do, with a legend that sits halfway between the waves of myth and the shores of history. In this tale, the ancestor Merovech was said to be conceived when his mother encountered a sea creature off the coast of the Frankish lands, a beast sometimes described as a kinotaur, part bull, part fish. It is a tale that sounds like the stuff of ancient Greek myths, but it belonged to the Franks, the Germanic people who carved out kingdoms in the ruins of Roman Gaul. Whether Merovech was born of a sea monster or simply of a political marriage, he gave his name to the dynasty that would reign for nearly 3 centuries, the Merovingians. One of the most distinctive features of this dynasty was their hair. They were known as the long-haired kings. While most warriors of their time cut their hair short as a mark of discipline, the Merovingians let their locks grow unshorn, cascading over their shoulders. Their hair was not vanity alone. It was seen as a physical embodiment of their sacred right to rule. To cut the hair of a Merovingian king was to strip him not only of dignity, but of the mystical force that bound him to his people. Chroniclers even recorded cases where deposed kings were forced into monasteries, their heads shaved as if their very power had been severed with the scissors. It is a curious quirk of history, this obsession with hair. Today it may seem trivial, but across cultures, hair has carried deep symbolism. Samson in the Hebrew Bible drew his strength from his uncut locks, only to be undone when Delilah sheared them away. In Merovingian Gaul, the unshorn hair became a crown in itself, a sign visible to every subject that this man was chosen, set apart, and untouchable. And yet, this reliance on something so fragile also meant that the Merovingian aura could be destroyed with a single haircut. Power lived in strands that could be shorn in an instant. Into this world of myth and ritual stepped Clovis, perhaps the most famous of the Merovingians. Ruling from the late 5th century into the early 6th, Clovis united the fractious Frankish tribes under his banner. His military victories against the Alemanni and the Visigoths secured him territory and renown. But it was his baptism, around the year 496, that sealed his legacy. Legend says that when Clovis's wife, the Burgundian princess Clotilde, urged him toward Christianity, he resisted until the moment came in battle when he vowed to the Christian God, if victory was granted, he would convert. Victory came, and so too did the baptism. On Christmas Day, Clovis and 3,000 of his warriors were baptized in rams by Bishop Remigius. The ceremony bound the blood of the Merovingian kings to the sacrament of the Church, intertwining dynasty and faith in a single moment of ritual. It was more than personal salvation, it was political genius. By embracing Christianity, Clovis earned the support of the Roman clergy and the legitimacy of being seen not just as a tribal warlord, but as a king anointed by divine authority. The act set the precedent that would echo for centuries across Europe. Kings would rule not by sword alone, but by a mandate sanctified at the altar. The debated point, however, is how much of this story happened as legend tells it. Did Clovis truly make that battlefield vow? Or is it a later embellishment to cast him as a second Constantine, the Roman emperor who converted after seeing a cross in the sky? Some historians argue that Clovis' conversion was less a lightning bolt of faith and more a gradual calculation of alliances, particularly with the powerful Gallo-Roman elites who could ease his rule. The story of mass baptism may have been streamlined to present a clear image of sudden, transformation, but in reality the process was uneven, slower, and layered with politics. The waters of Rams may have cleansed Clovis, but they also served as ink, writing his rule into the great book of Christendom. If we look closer at the sensory world of that moment, it becomes easier to feel the weight of the event. Imagine the echo of church bells rolling through the cold winter air, the smell of frankincense rising in the cathedral as candle flames danced against stone walls. Clovis, with his long hair unshorn, stepping barefoot into the baptismal font, the water chilling his skin. The steel of swords, once drawn in battle, now resting quietly by the side of the baptistery, as warriors stood in reverence, and Bishop Remigius raising his hand, pouring water upon the king's head, declaring that with this act, the Frankish people were born anew. For all its grandeur, there were odd details. Chroniclers describe Clovis being dressed afterward in a white garment, his hair dripping as the choir sang hymns in Latin, words perhaps foreign to the ears of Frankish warriors. Some accounts even claim a dove descended with holy oil, a heavenly sign echoing the anointings of Old Testament kings. Whether the dove was a bird startled from the rafters or an invention of poetic license, it added a flourish to the narrative. It was as though the chroniclers themselves knew that the story of Clovis needed to sparkle with miracles to cement its weight in memory. The longer shadow of this moment was not merely spiritual. By binding the Merovingian dynasty to the church, Clovis created a partnership that would later prove double-edged. The church became the legitimizer of kings, but also the judge of their worthiness. When centuries later Pepin the Short sought to depose the last Merovingian, he too would appeal to the Pope for blessing, showing how the crown that Clovis claimed through baptism could one day be wielded against his heirs. What was once salvation could become condemnation, a reminder that sacred symbols often cut both ways. And yet, despite the uncertainties of legend and the fragile nature of hair or water, the imagery of Clovis' baptism endures. It represents the moment when the wild forest of the Franks was bound to the marble halls of Rome, when long-haired kings became not only rulers of tribes, but actors in the drama of Christendom. The steel of swords was softened by bells of churches, and the mist of myth was thickened with the incense of ritual. As we linger on this chapter of beginnings, we feel the tension between myth and record. The sea beast father of Merovech, the unshorn hair like a crown, the miraculous dove at Rheims. Each detail teeters between fact and faith, between quirky tale and solemn chronicle. But together they create a portrait of a dynasty that claimed both heaven and earth as its domain. And so, from the waters of baptism and the hair of kings, the Merovingians stepped into history. Their story would be one of grandeur, of slow decline, and perhaps of whispered survival far beyond the reach of Rome. But before we follow them into their long descent, we pause with one question. Was their power ever truly theirs? Or was it always borrowed, flowing like water from the font of the church? That question leads us into the next part of our journey, where prophecy stirs in the margins of a northern saga, and whispers of ice and blood merge into a single line of riddle. In the dim corners of medieval manuscripts, there are sometimes scribbles and notes that seem more like whispers than declarations. Marginalia, the scholars call them. Words written in the margins by hands long dead, sometimes clarifying, sometimes joking, sometimes hinting at things too dangerous to put in the body of the text. Among these faint voices is one that has intrigued a generation of dreamers, a line tucked beside a Norse saga of the late 13th century, known to some as the Northern Prophecy. The words themselves are sparse, but they carry the weight of riddle. In one translation they read, "When the blood of the southern kings meets the sleep of the ice, the crown shall rise again, cold but unbroken." The handwriting is cramped, as though the scribe wanted it hidden. The ink is brown with age, and the letters waver between Latin and Old Norse forms, making it difficult to know the exact tongue intended. Was it a prophecy, a proverb, or merely the idle musing of a monk? As a matter of fact, scholars acknowledge that such marginal notations are not unusual in Norse manuscripts. The Icelandic sagas, copied and recopied in monasteries, often attracted scribes who would leave comments in Latin or vernacular languages. Some notes catalogued the weather. Others inserted genealogies. Still others repeated familiar proverbs. The presence of marginalia itself is not extraordinary. What makes this line peculiar is its content. The mention of southern kings and the imagery of ice-bound crowns. The quirky element here is how the phrase has lived a second life far beyond the parchment. Folklorists in Scandinavia have repeated it in tales of a king whose blood lies frozen beneath glaciers, waiting to wake. In some versions, he is a Frankish monarch who fled across the sea. In others, he is a Viking lord who intermarried with distant royalty. The words shift like mist from village to village, but always return to the same image: blood from the south, ice from the north, a crown in waiting. The resonance of that imagery has made the Northern Prophecy a favorite among those who weave connections between the Merovingians and lands far from Gaul. But here we meet the debated question: is the prophecy real in the sense of having been written in the 13th century, or is it an invention, a later interpolation slipped into the story by imaginative collectors? Some medievalists argue that the line cannot be confidently dated. The manuscript in which it supposedly appears has not been preserved in its original form. The copy we have is from a later century, and it is possible that the prophecy was added by a later scribe, not by the medieval monk himself. Others even suggest that the entire thing may be a modern fabrication, a flourish invented by antiquarians in the 19th century, when fascination with secret bloodlines and hidden dynasties was at its height. Still, even if the line is spurious, its power lies in suggestion. The idea that a royal bloodline might find refuge in the frozen north resonates with themes already alive in medieval imagination. Norse mythology itself is filled with sleeping kings and hidden realms. Arthur is said to rest on Avalon, waiting for return. Charlemagne, in later legend, was imagined as sleeping within a mountain. To place the Merovingians into a similar cycle, that they had not ended but only slumbered, was to grant them a mythic endurance. Silence, in this scheme, was not death. It was merely hibernation. Picture the scribe at his desk, perhaps in Iceland or Norway, in a stone chamber lit by oil lamps. Outside, the snow presses against the shutters, muffling the night. He copies a saga about warriors and voyages, his quill scratching against the vellum. In a pause, his mind drifts. He has heard rumors, perhaps, of foreign kings, or of knights in white mantles fleeing persecution further south. Perhaps he himself has no clear story, only fragments, and so he writes a single sentence in the margin: a cryptic seed, the blood of southern kings, the sleep of ice, a crown to rise. Then he dips his pen again and continues with the saga, leaving us centuries later to puzzle over the orphaned words. The sensory imagery is haunting. One can imagine the clash of steel on frozen ground, the tolling of a bell carried faintly through the mist, the shadow of a forest at the edge of the fjord, and beneath it all the suggestion of a crown buried under snow. It is a scene both fragile and enduring, like frost patterns on glass. Even if the prophecy is a later invention, it functions as a symbol for how people think about history. Dynasties rarely vanish in a single instant. Bloodlines scatter, intermarry, and fade into the fabric of the population. But legends gather them again, weaving them into patterns of continuity. The Merovingians, shorn of their hair and their throne, might have been absorbed into noble houses or forgotten entirely, yet with a single sentence in the margin, they are given a second life, not as rulers of Gaul, but as dreamers sleeping beneath northern snow. The image of blood and ice together is especially potent. Blood is warm, flowing, intimate. Ice is cold, still, preserving. To marry the two is to imagine life held in suspension, neither alive nor dead, but waiting. It is easy to see why later storytellers embraced the idea. In a time when exile and refuge were common, when monks and knights alike wandered in search of safety, the notion that a royal crown could hibernate until the world was ready again was deeply appealing. Some modern readers, however, push the imagery even further. They see in the prophecy a coded reference to the Templars, who, after their suppression in 1307, are said by legend to have fled northward. The blood of the southern kings could symbolize a lineage entrusted to them. The sleep of the ice could signify their refuge in Scandinavia. The crown that rises again might be not literal royalty, but a symbolic memory, kept alive in ritual and architecture. Whether this interpretation is valid or fanciful remains open, but it shows the power of a single marginal note to ignite entire worlds of speculation. And so, the Northern prophecy remains a shadow on the page. It could be medieval truth, a later forgery, or nothing more than the imagination of collectors. Yet it lingers because it speaks to something human, the longing that what has been lost is not truly gone, but sleeping, waiting to awaken. As we leave this prophecy in the margin, the bells of the north still echo faintly. The steel of history may cut, but mist gathers around it, softening the edge. Ahead of us lies the slow unraveling of Merovingian power, the scissors of the Carolingians ready to cut the long hair. But before we reach that fall, the prophecy bids us to wonder, what if the crown was never broken, only resting beneath the snow? That question leads us onward, into the unfolding of history where power shifts, where crowns fall, and where the church itself becomes the hand that lifts one dynasty while pressing another into silence. History, like a bell tolling across the mist, can sometimes be condensed into a handful of moments that echo louder than all the rest. Imagine a card laid before you, not covered in endless text, but bearing just 4 inscriptions, 4 points along a steel thread stretched through centuries. These 4 dates, like markers carved upon a tree in the forest, help us navigate the otherwise tangled undergrowth of Merovingian legacy and its strange northern aftershocks. The first is the year 679, when King Dagobert II met his end. Chroniclers tell us he was assassinated while hunting in the Vosges Mountains, pierced through the eye with a spear. His death was not only the fall of a king, but also the beginning of whispers. Later, legend claimed Dagobert had been targeted by conspirators linked to the church itself, eager to place pliable rulers upon the throne. For centuries afterward, secret histories and alternative accounts suggested that Dagobert's bloodline did not perish with him. Some claimed his children were hidden, spirited away, like embers smuggled out of a dying fire. Here lies the fact. Dagobert II was indeed murdered in 679, and his dynasty weakened swiftly thereafter. That much the official record confirms. The quirk lies in the imaginative expansions that followed, claims that his descendants fled, that they carried secret knowledge or sacred relics, that his death was not an end but a doorway. The debated element, of course, is whether these whispers have any basis at all. Was his assassination truly orchestrated with the blessing of high-ranking clergy? Or was it simply the ruthless, familiar pattern of political survival, sharpened by myth only in hindsight? The second line reads 751, the year when the last Merovingian, Childeric III, was deposed by Pepin the Short. The scissors, both literal and symbolic, were brought forth. Childeric's long hair was shorn, the ancient sign of his dynasty's sacred authority stripped away. He was sent into a monastery, his kingship dissolved. In his place, Pepin, the father of Charlemagne, took the throne with the blessing of the Pope. It was a surgical act of history, cutting off one branch to graft another. The Carolingians rose, and the Merovingians were said to be finished. The fact is as sharp as a blade. Childeric III's deposition ended the line of long-haired kings. The quirky note comes from the almost theatrical ritual of hair-cutting, a gesture that held immense symbolic weight in Frankish culture. Imagine a king humbled not by the loss of armies, but by the snip of scissors, his strands falling like fallen banners to the floor. The debated point remains whether this was truly the extinction of a bloodline's power. Did the Merovingian legacy truly die in the cloisters, or did it persist invisibly, folded into other houses, waiting for another hour? The third inscription on our card is 1307, a date that tolls like a black bell in the night. On Friday the 13th of October, King Philip IV of France ordered the mass arrest of the Knights Templar. In a single sweep, an order that had grown rich and powerful, guardians of pilgrims and bankers to monarchs, was declared heretical. Their leaders were tortured, their properties seized, their fleet at La Rochelle rumored to vanish into the mist. Fact tells us the suppression was real, the arrests brutal, the trials damning. The quirky ripple lies in the myths that sprang up almost immediately. Whispers of treasure carts rolling out under the cover of darkness, of ships unfurling sails for unknown destinations, of relics spirited away to Scotland, to Portugal, even to the frozen Baltic. The debated point is whether any of these tales have substance. Did the fleet of La Rochelle truly vanish into exile, carrying with it not only gold, but also secrets, perhaps even bloodlines entrusted to their care? Or is it all smoke rising from the bonfire of their downfall? The fourth line gleams faintly, marked as around 1320. Here the evidence is softer, like footprints half hidden in snow. Archaeologists have uncovered layers of artifacts in Baltic sites, carved stones with symbols that echo both Frankish and Norse styles. In Gotland, in Iceland, and in the far north, certain motifs, spirals, bees, roses, appear where one would not expect them. They are not always dated precisely, but many cluster in the early 14th century, suspiciously close to the aftermath of the Templar dispersal. The fact here is that unusual artifacts exist: hybrid carvings, anomalous inscriptions, odd overlaps of design. The quirk is the specificity of some of them. A spiral etched beside what looks like a lily or a rose, a funerary object decorated with shapes that resemble bees. The debated question, naturally, is interpretation. Are these merely the accidents of artistic cross-pollination, the inevitable mingling of styles in a trading hub? Or do they represent the footsteps of men carrying forbidden banners into exile, embedding their marks in northern stone? Together, these four dates, 679, 751, 1307, 1320, form not a straight line but a chain, cold links forged across centuries. Dagobert's fall, Childeric's deposition, the destruction of the Templars, the strange northern symbols. Each is a tolling bell in the mist, a sound that lingers and overlaps with the next. They may not be connected in the strict sense of archival proof, but in the realm of story, they resonate like harmonics, each one deepening the note of the other. If you imagine these four dates as carved upon a single slab, you might see them as the skeleton of our tale. Around them swirl hair and crowns, prophecies and whispers, ships and stones. Without them, the story would drift unanchored. With them, it gains a structure, however fragile, on which to rest its mist. The quirky power of such a compressed timeline is that it feels almost like a riddle in itself. Four numbers, each separated by generations, yet bound by suggestion. It is the kind of thing that medieval minds love to do, tie distant events into patterns of providence. And in our own time, it is the kind of skeleton that allows speculative histories to stand upright long enough for us to walk around them and peer at their shadows. And so, the four-line card lies before us, as though a knight in steel armor had left it upon a chapel altar for us to read. Its words are not many, but their weight is heavy. They remind us that history, like a forest path in fog, is marked by only a few visible stones, while all the rest sinks into silence. As we turn from this card, we step deeper into the story. Ahead lies the moment when the long-haired kings are shorn not only of hair but of destiny, when Pepin and the papacy join hands to write a new chapter. But the bells of 679, 751, 1307, and 1320 still toll behind us, their sound mingling with the mist as we walk forward. The image of a Merovingian king was once inseparable from the length of his hair. In a time before crowns were standardized and regalia mass-produced, it was the strands flowing from the head of the monarch that proclaimed his sacred status. Long, uncut hair was more than fashion. It was the living emblem of legitimacy. So when the last Merovingian ruler, Childeric III, was forced into a monastery in 751 and his hair was cut, the act was not just humiliation. It was a declaration that his dynasty had come to an end. What is less obvious, but perhaps more important, is that the cutting was not done merely with shears. It was done with words, with parchment, with the soft scratch of a quill dipped in ink. For centuries, the Merovingian kings had dwindled in power while their mayors of the palace, the majordomos, grew in strength. By the mid-8th century, it was Pepin the Short, son of Charles Martel, who held the reins of authority in practice. He commanded armies, managed the treasury, negotiated alliances, Childeric, meanwhile, was little more than a figurehead, a shadow of the long-haired majesty that once strode proudly across Gaul. The chroniclers even called him a roi fainéant, a do-nothing king. The palace hummed with Pepin's decisions, while the king's presence was ceremonial at best. The fact is clear. In 751, Pepin formally deposed Childeric III and assumed the crown. What makes this moment unique in history is the way it was legitimized. Pepin sent envoys to Pope Zachary, posing the question, who should be king? The man who holds the title but no power, or the man who holds the power but not the title? The Pope's answer was decisive. Better for the man who holds power to also hold the name. With papal blessing, Pepin was anointed king, and the Merovingian line was shorn from history as swiftly as Childeric's hair was shorn from his head. The quirky detail lies in the very act of cutting the hair. To modern eyes, it seems an odd ritual, almost comical, a dynasty ending with scissors. Yet for the Franks, this was profound. A king with hair cut short could no longer reign. His sanctity was lost, his mystical authority dissolved. Sending Childeric to a monastery was both a punishment and a burial of sorts, as if the cloister were a living tomb for a lineage. One can almost hear the rustle of hair falling to the ground, mingling with the scratch of the papal reply. Steel and parchment working in tandem. The debated point is how much the Church truly orchestrated this transition. Was the papacy acting purely in service to Frankish politics? Or was it consciously removing a dynasty that had grown inconvenient? Some argue that the Merovingians had long been sidelined and that their sacred aura had grown dim, so the papal decision was less a conspiracy and more a formality. Others insist that the Church feared the lingering mystique of the long-haired kings, preferring a dynasty, Pepin's Carolingians, that owed its very legitimacy to papal authority. In this view, the scissors did not just cut hair, they severed a dangerous bond between royalty and divinity, replacing it with a bond that tethered kings to Rome. Picture the moment with sensory clarity. The cloister is dim, lit by flickering candles. Childeric sits silently, perhaps with the resignation of one who knows that power has long since slipped from his grasp. The sound of shears snips through the air, louder in memory than it was in reality. Each lock of hair falls like a broken thread of destiny, piling on the stone floor. Outside, church bells ring, marking the dawn of Pepin's reign. The parchment with the papal answer lies on a table, the ink still glistening. What steel could not accomplish, ink and scissors have achieved together. To feel the weight of this event, one must recall how power was understood in that era. It was not enough to wield the sword. Legitimacy had to be sanctified. Without blessing, power was brute force. With blessing, power became ordained. Pepin understood this keenly. His father, Charles Martel, had wielded enormous military strength but had never taken the royal title, perhaps wary of overstepping bounds without papal support. Pepin, however, saw an opportunity to fuse sword and script, to claim both the steel of battle and the ink of Rome. By doing so, he set a precedent that would shape the medieval world. Kings could rise and fall not only by the clash of armies, but by the stroke of a pen. And yet, even as Pepin was crowned, whispers lingered. Could a dynasty so ancient, so steeped in myth, really vanish with a haircut? The Merovingians had claimed descent from a sea-born creature, their blood infused with mystery. They had been baptized in the waters of Rheims, tying their line to the destiny of Christendom. Could such a legacy be erased so tidily by scissors and ink? Some said no. Some believed that while Childeric was cloistered, others of his blood remained outside, hidden, preserved, waiting. Thus, the myth of survival was born, the idea that the line had not ended, only slipped into shadow, into silence. From a certain angle, the act itself almost encouraged such myths. To cut hair is to conceal the old form, but hair grows back. To send a king into a monastery is to remove him from sight, but monasteries are places of writing, of recording. Might not a monk, sympathetic to his fallen king, have left behind a note, a symbol, a story to be found centuries later? The forest of history is filled with such possibilities, and in the mist of time, even a haircut becomes a seed of legend. What we know for certain is that 750 marked the official end of Merovingian rule. Pepin the Short was crowned, and his son Charlemagne would become the great figure who defined medieval Europe. The Carolingians owed their legitimacy not to their own hair or myths, but to the papal blessing. They were, in a sense, kings made of ink and steel, not of sea creatures and strands. Yet the loss of the Merovingians left a void, a silence into which later storytellers would pour their imaginations. And so, the long-haired kings faded from the stage, their strands scattered, their crowns removed. But in the echo of bells, in the cut of scissors, in the rustle of parchment, their memory endured. The question remained, were they truly gone, or had they only shifted into the margins, like a prophecy waiting in the mist? That question opens the door to our next chapter. For if kings can be shorn by documents and scissors, perhaps they can also be preserved by whispers, by prophecies, by symbols carved in wood and stone. And soon we will turn to the Templars, to the fleet that vanished into mist, and to the possibility that the Merovingian bloodline, like a hidden bell in the forest, continued to toll in secret. The date is etched into memory like a scar upon medieval Europe, October 13th, 1307. A Friday, the kind that centuries later would become synonymous with ill fortune. On that day, as dawn spread across France, the king's men moved in silence through towns and villages, bearing sealed orders. When the orders were opened, they revealed a command from King Philip IV. Every knight of the temple, the famed Templars, was to be arrested. It was a sweep unlike any other, executed with ruthless precision, as if the steel of justice, or injustice, had been sharpened overnight. The Knights Templar had once been revered. Founded after the First Crusade, they began as a small brotherhood sworn to protect pilgrims on the road to Jerusalem. Their white mantles, adorned with a red cross, soon became symbols of dedication and martial sanctity. Over the next 2 centuries, they grew into a powerhouse, amassing lands, castles, and wealth that rivaled monarchs themselves. They were not only warriors, but also bankers, holding deposits for kings, financing crusades, and building a network that spanned Christendom. By the early 1300s, they were indispensable, and that made them dangerous. The fact is this: Philip IV, known as Philip the Fair, was drowning in debt. Wars against England and Flanders had emptied his coffers. The Templars, who once lent him vast sums, now stood as creditors rather than subjects. To destroy them was to erase his debts and seize their riches. With the cooperation of Pope Clement V, and who himself was maneuvered under French influence, Philip struck. On that October morning, thousands of Templars were seized. They were accused of heresies too dark to ignore, spitting on the cross, worshipping idols, denying Christ. Whether these charges were real or fabricated, they served their purpose. The order was broken, its leaders tortured and burned, its reputation shattered. Yet the quirk of this story lies in what happened, or did not happen, at the port of La Rochelle. According to tradition, the Templars maintained a fleet there, a group of ships used for trade and transport across the seas. On the night before the arrests, so the story goes, that fleet vanished. Some said the ships slipped quietly into the Atlantic, sails catching the wind of escape. Others imagine them heading northward, to the shores of Scotland, or even further still, to the cold waters of Scandinavia. The fleet became a ghost armada, its fate unknown, its very existence debated. But the legend of its disappearance has never lost its grip on the imagination. Historians continue to debate whether the fleet even existed in significant form. Some argue there is little evidence for a vast naval presence at La Rochelle in 1307, pointing out that while the Templars had ships, they were not a great maritime power. Others counter that their trading connections across the Mediterranean and beyond suggest they could have assembled vessels sufficient to whisk away treasure, relics, or even men of high importance. And here, in the midst of uncertainty, legends sprouted like mushrooms after rain. The missing fleet became the vessel of possibility, carrying gold, carrying secrets, perhaps even carrying bloodlines too dangerous to leave behind. Picture it in your mind's eye. The night of October 12th is cold, the harbor cloaked in fog. Lanterns flicker on the piers, casting pools of light on the water. The hulls of ships creak as the tide shifts, ropes groaning like weary throats. Cloaked figures move in silence, loading crates, leading horses, guiding men aboard. A bell tolls in the distance, muffled by mist. By dawn, the ships are gone, the water disturbed only by ripples fading into stillness. When the king's men arrive, expecting to seize not only knights but treasures, they find absence instead. Steel may arrest men, but it cannot grasp what has already slipped beyond reach. The debated point becomes central here. Where, if anywhere, did those ships go? Some say Scotland, where Robert the Bruce had been excommunicated and was therefore willing to harbor enemies of the Pope. Others point to Portugal, where the Templars would later re-emerge under another name, the Order of Christ. Still others imagine the cold Baltic, where symbols of the temple appear carved in wood and stone, long after the suppression. The truth remains elusive, but the possibility itself is enough to weave the Templars into every legend of survival. In the centuries that followed, storytellers embroidered the tale. Some claimed the fleet carried the Holy Grail, that most elusive relic of Christendom. Others believed it carried sacred documents, genealogies of royal lines, or maps to hidden places. Still others whispered that it carried people, individuals whose blood was considered too precious to fall into the hands of enemies. If the Merovingian line had found guardians in the Templars, then perhaps, on that October night, the last embers of their bloodline were spirited away into the mist. The sensory weight of this moment cannot be overstated. Imagine the clang of steel as knights were dragged from their beds in Paris, the heavy slam of doors as monasteries were searched, the cries of men accused of spitting upon the very cross they had sworn to defend. Imagine the sound of parchment tearing open, the king's orders read aloud in chilling tones, and then contrast it with the silence at La Rochelle, where only the sigh of wind and the creak of masts marked the departure of something that may or may not have existed. Steel and silence, ink and mist, both work together to erase and to preserve. There's something almost theatrical about the suppression. Philip IV, desperate and calculating, turned accusation into weapon, using heresy as a blade sharper than any sword. The Pope, caught in political tides, played his role. The Templars themselves, once lionized, were broken not in battle, but in the dark corners of dungeons, tortured until confession spilled forth. Yet through it all, the missing fleet hangs like a curtain half drawn, refusing to close the play. It invites us to imagine a different ending, one in which the Templars did not vanish entirely, but transformed, melted into other lands, leaving faint crosses in northern forests and whispers of survival in stone. The long night of October 1307 was not just the end of an order. It was the birth of a legend. Legends, unlike kings, cannot be imprisoned. They travel, they adapt, they find new harbors. And as the bells of that Friday faded, the story of the Templars began to spread, seeded with absence and nourished by uncertainty. And so we step from this moment into the broader question. If a fleet vanished, where did it land? What shores received its cargo, whether of gold or of blood? That question leads us northward, into the lands of stave churches and carved stones, where the echoes of red crosses linger like whispers in the mist. If the Templar fleet truly slipped away from La Rochelle under the cloak of fog, the next question is one of direction. Where did the ships go, and what traces did they leave behind? For centuries, a handful of signs scattered across the northern world have been gathered into a mosaic of suggestion, each fragment whispering of men in white mantles who fled beyond the reach of kings and inquisitors. These are not solid proofs carved in marble, but faint footprints in snow, visible, then vanishing, then glimpsed again in the distance. The fact is simple. Scandinavian stave churches, those haunting wooden cathedrals with steep, overlapping roofs like dragon scales, are real and still standing. Built between the 12th and 14th centuries, they blend Norse motifs with Christian iconography in a way found nowhere else. Within several of them, careful observers have noted carvings of crosses that bear uncanny resemblance to the flared, splayed-armed crosses favored by the Templars. While not identical, the likeness is close enough to stir curiosity. Could these crosses have been carved by local craftsmen who had once seen the red-crossed knights? Or were they purely decorative, coincidental echoes of a broader Christian style? The quirky detail is that one such church in Norway bears a carving of a cross accompanied by a pair of bees. Bees, as we have already seen, are not typical northern Christian symbols. They belonged far more naturally to Merovingian lore, buzzing golden in the tomb of Childeric III, centuries earlier. That such a pairing should appear on a stave church panel seems odd, almost mischievous, as if the woodcarver left behind a riddle for future eyes. Bees on a cross, spirals on beams, roses tucked into corners. These are not the expected decorations of rural churches, and their presence continues to puzzle visitors. The debated point lies in interpretation. Are these symbols remnants of a deliberate code carried by fugitive Templars who sought sanctuary in the north? Or are they merely the accidents of artistic exchange, with styles mingling as travelers pass through trading routes? Skeptics argue that spiral designs and ornate crosses were common across Europe, and that to assign Templar fingerprints to them is to mistake coincidence for conspiracy. Yet the very density of such anomalies in certain regions, like Norway, Iceland, and Gotland, encourages speculation. The line between coincidence and pattern is often drawn by desire, and in the case of the Templars, desire for survival is strong. Imagine standing inside one of these Stave churches. The air smells of resin and ancient wood, seasoned by centuries of candle smoke. Light filters dimly through narrow windows, striking carvings that twist like vines along the beams. Your eyes adjust, and there, amid dragons and suns, you notice a cross. Its arms flared, its lines bold. At first you think it a standard Christian symbol, but then you see the small details. The bees, the spiral etched behind it, the faint rose-like curve worked into the frame. Did the craftsman know what he was doing? Was he instructed to carve this as a sign for those who would recognize it? Or was he simply copying a pattern seen in a passing manuscript, unaware of the meaning that later generations would press upon it? Alongside these churches, there are also stones. Iceland in particular holds graves from the late medieval period that bear inscriptions, blending runes and Latin letters. Some include crosses with unusual designs, again reminiscent of those favored by Templars. One stone, now weathered and cracked, was said to bear the Latin phrase, regnum non perit sed dormit. The kingdom does not perish, but sleeps. It is almost too perfect, a phrase that matches too neatly the themes of hidden bloodlines and sleeping crowns. And indeed, skeptics point out that the phrase may have been misread, or even invented later. But still, the words linger like a bell tone, carried across centuries, impossible to completely dismiss. The folklore of the region adds yet another layer. In certain coastal sagas, there are references to strangers arriving by ship, cloaked and solemn, bearing no local kinship but welcomed for their skill in building, in farming, or in healing. They were sometimes described as wearing red upon their garments, though the meaning of that detail is uncertain. To some, it is the faint memory of the red cross on a white mantle. To others, it is coincidence, nothing more than a splash of color in a story that has been retold too many times. What makes these northern traces so tantalizing is how they tie into the great absence of 1307. When men vanish, stories sprout in the gaps. The Templars left behind a silence so profound that it begged to be filled. And so, the stave churches, the stones, the inscriptions, the sagas, all were recruited as fillers for that silence. Steel had cut down the order in France, but mist and forest seemed to cradle them elsewhere, preserving echoes that should not exist. To walk among these relics is to feel history shifting underfoot. Each carving, each inscription is like a footprint in snow, clear in outline, but melting, fading, leaving behind only the suggestion of passage. If one looks too closely, the footprint dissolves. But if one steps back, the trail begins to emerge, winding northward, always into deeper mist. And so we arrive at the debated edge of interpretation. Are these northern footprints real? Evidence of survival? Or are they only projections of our own longing for hidden continuity? History demands caution, but the human heart leans toward wonder. Perhaps it is enough to acknowledge both, that the stave churches and the stones are beautiful artifacts in their own right, and that they also serve as stages upon which our imaginations reenact the dramas of vanished knights and whispered bloodlines. In the end, whether or not the Templars truly left their mark on the North, the symbols themselves endure. They toll like bells through the wooden beams. They glimmer like frost on the stones. They hum faintly like bees in the silence of snow. They are traces, not proofs, but traces have their own kind of power. And so, following these footprints into the forest of history, we find ourselves at the threshold of deeper riddles. Ahead lie the maps of migration, the spirals and roses that cluster along certain coasts, the hybrid graves that seem half Frankish, half Norse. If the fleet sailed north, this is where it may have landed. And with each symbol carved into wood and stone, the question deepens. Was it coincidence? Or was it code? There is a power in maps that is unlike any other artifact. A sword may be admired, a crown may glitter, but a map whispers of possibility. It does not simply record where one has been. It invites the imagination to travel where one has not. In the story of the Merovingians and the vanished Templars, the most tantalizing image is not of a battlefield or a cloister, but of a line of movement. From the French port of La Rochelle, across the ocean lanes to Iceland, onward to Norway and Sweden, and finally to the island of Gotland, the hub of Baltic trade. To lay such a route upon a map is to watch the whispers of history acquire direction. The fact is plain enough. Each of these places, La Rochelle, Iceland, Scandinavia, Gotland, was active in the medieval world, connected by trade routes of timber, furs, grain, and iron. La Rochelle itself was a bustling harbor, deeply tied to both commerce and crusade. Iceland had been settled by Norsemen for centuries and kept a lively traffic of ships with Norway and beyond. Gotland, sitting in the heart of the Baltic, was a jewel of the Hanseatic network, its merchants trading far into Russia and south into the heart of Europe. No one disputes that these locations were tied by maritime lines. The question is whether the Templars, fleeing arrest in 1307, followed those lines into exile. The quirky element here lies in the oddities of distribution. In each of these places, artifacts have been found that seem slightly out of place, as though they had been dropped by travelers whose identities we cannot quite pin down. In Iceland, certain gravestones bear Latin inscriptions unfamiliar to local custom. In Norway, stave churches contain carvings whose style echoes Frankish motifs. In Gotland, archaeologists have unearthed funerary items marked with bees, roses, and spirals, symbols that to some feel strangely foreign, oddly consistent with Merovingian lore. The idea that these motifs appear along the very path the fleet might have taken lends the map its allure. It is as though a faint trail of pollen were scattered across the north, left by bees traveling far from their hive. The debated point, of course, is whether these anomalies amount to evidence or simply to coincidence. Trade routes are messy things. Merchants carry goods from one end of the world to another, and designs migrate as easily as spices or cloth. A spiral in Gotland might reflect Celtic influence. A rose in a stave church might be nothing more than a decorative flourish. The presence of Latin in Iceland could come from missionaries rather than fugitives. To insist that every anomaly is a footprint risks turning history into a hall of mirrors where we see only what we expect to see. Yet to ignore the clustering of such anomalies along a plausible path of flight feels equally unsatisfying. Picture the map itself as it might appear in a medieval manuscript. The parchment is yellowed, the ink a deep brown, lines drawn with steady but imperfect hand. La Rochelle is marked with a small ship, sails furled. From it, a line extends westward into the ocean, curving north to Iceland, where a cross is inked. Then the line bends east toward Norway, threading through fjords and forests, before dropping down to Gotland, where a spiral is drawn beside a small rose. Each mark is a symbol, not a proof, but together they weave a story. Standing in La Rochelle, one can almost feel the beginning of that line. The harbor is alive with gulls and salt wind, the smell of fish and tar thick in the air. Wooden piers stretch into the water, and ships with high prows creak as they strain against their ropes. Imagine cloaked men boarding such vessels in the dead of night, carrying with them not only treasure, but memory. From there, the journey begins. The steel of anchors lifts, the bells of the port fade, and the mist of the Atlantic swallows them whole. Weeks later, a sail appears off the coast of Iceland, the land rising like dark rock out of endless gray sea. Villagers point and murmur of strangers arriving. The ship unloads crates. What lies inside? No one can say. The travelers move on, perhaps leaving behind a stone with curious markings, perhaps carving a phrase that lingers centuries later. Then they vanish again, sailing east into waters colder still. In Norway, the Stave churches rise like forests within forests, their wooden beams layered like bark, their carvings blending dragon heads with Christian crosses. A stranger with skilled hands might add his own mark, carving a spiral here, a rose there, perhaps as a message to others who would recognize it. To local eyes, it is just decoration. To those in the know, it is code. The bell tolls, the mist gathers, and the journey continues. Finally, Gotland. The island hums with trade, its markets filled with spices, silks, iron, and amber. Here, where merchants from east and west meet, a foreign knight could disappear. A grave might be dug, a sword buried with markings unfamiliar to locals, a spiral etched on the hilt, a bee engraved on the scabbard. To future archaeologists, these will seem curious. To the ones who buried them, they were signs, reminders, perhaps even oaths. The beauty of this imagined journey lies in how it binds together disparate places into a single narrative. Each location alone might be explained as coincidence. Together, they form a line, a path through mist and sea, connecting the disappearance at La Rochelle to the anomalies of the north. Like beads on a string, they suggest continuity. The map becomes not just parchment, but a story, a steel thread winding through centuries, tolling faintly like a bell in the forest. Yet here we must pause with humility. Maps are invitations, not verdicts. They show possibilities, not certainties. The line from La Rochelle to Gotland may be as much a creation of our imagination as it is of history. But in the dark, when bells echo and forests whisper, imagination itself becomes a kind of truth. Perhaps it does not matter whether the fleet truly followed this path. What matters is that the path exists for us to follow in thought, to wander through mist with eyes wide open. And so, the map lies before us, its ink fading, but its lines still visible. La Rochelle, Iceland, Norway, Gotland, 4 points, like the tolling of 4 bells, each marking a step deeper into mystery. Ahead of us lies the evidence on the ground, the stones, the graves, the spirals etched into steel. If the map is the outline of a story, these are its words carved in matter. And so we walk forward, from parchment into earth, from lines into symbols, following the trail further into the forest of history. If maps give us the path, graves give us the pause. In the soil of northern Europe, under stone and turf, traces of the past wait patiently. Archaeologists, like careful gardeners, brush away the centuries to uncover what remains. Among the discoveries that trouble the clear borders of history are a handful of graves in places such as Gotland, Norway, and Iceland. They are graves that seem to speak in two voices at once, one Nordic, one foreign. It is as if the forest and the sea shared the same tomb, binding cultures that were never meant to lie side by side. The fact is undeniable. In Gotland especially, there are graves from the late 13th and early 14th centuries that contain objects blending Frankish and Scandinavian styles. Swords have been unearthed, with hilts decorated not in the purely geometric or animal-based patterns of Viking tradition, but with designs more familiar to Western Europe. On one blade, faint but unmistakable, appears a pattern resembling a rose, its petals curling in stylized form. On another, a spiral has been etched shallowly into the steel, looping, as though to remind the viewer of cycles and continuities. Such designs are not unheard of in Northern art, but their clustering in specific graves and their hybrid forms raise questions that echo louder than certainty. The quirky detail, perhaps the most charming of all, is the so-called bee sword. The weapon itself is now rusted, its steel eaten by centuries in the earth. But on its pommel, in gold inlay, tiny hexagonal shapes appear, with a small winged figure in the center. Some scholars describe it as a honeybee, stylized but unmistakable. Others argue it is merely a pattern of cells, decorative, and devoid of deeper meaning. Yet the resemblance to the bee sacred to the Merovingians and found by the hundreds in the tomb of Childeric I is difficult to ignore. To find such an emblem in a northern grave, far from the royal burials of France, feels like a riddle carved in steel. The debated point, of course, is whether these graves are evidence of cultural mingling through trade or of something more intentional. Gotland was a hub of the Hanseatic League, a crossroads where merchants from Russia, Germany, and beyond mingled. It is entirely possible that a sword with Frankish motifs could arrive through commerce, carried by a trader who had never seen battle. Yet the specific combination of rose, spiral, and bee symbols, so resonant with Merovingian lore, invites speculation. Were these marks coincidence, or were they a secret code, a way for exiles or their protectors to embed memory and matter? Imagine standing at the excavation site as the grave is uncovered. The soil is damp, smelling of earth and roots. Wooden planks, once a coffin, crumble to touch. A sword lies across the bones, its rust flaking away as the brush moves. Then the archaeologist gasps softly, leaning closer. The faint shape of a spiral emerges, catching the late afternoon light. A rose blooms in steel where no rose should ever have grown. In that moment, the grave ceases to be a silent resting place and becomes a voice, faint but insistent, whispering across the centuries. Spirals themselves carry a strange weight. In Norse art, spirals appear as suns, wheels, and endless loops. In Celtic tradition, the triple spiral or triskele marked cycles of life and death. For the Merovingians, Spirals became part of the coded trio, alongside the bee and the rose. To see a spiral on a sword in Gotland, paired with a rose motif, is like finding two languages sharing a single sentence. Was it simply a craftsman indulging in design? Or was it a deliberate act of remembrance by someone carrying both worlds in his heart? Folklore complicates matters further. In Gotland, tales persist of men from the West who came not as conquerors, but as wanderers, bringing with them knowledge of stone and symbol. They were said to bury their dead with care, marking graves with unusual signs. Some local stories describe foreign kings who passed through, leaving tokens behind. Whether these are mere inventions, retrofitted to explain odd finds, or echoes of genuine encounters, is impossible to prove. But the resonance between story and artifact is striking. The bee sword, the spiral etchings, the rose blade, each is a fragment, a footprint in snow. One could dismiss them, and many do. They could be explained away by trade, by coincidence, by the tendency of patterns to repeat across cultures. Yet when placed beside the missing fleet of La Rochelle, beside the Stave church carvings, beside the northern prophecy scrawled in a margin, they begin to form a pattern too suggestive to ignore. The forest of history is filled with fallen branches, but sometimes they line up just enough to look like a path. Picture the sensory world of these graves, the clink of trowels against stone, the chill of morning air on the dig site, breath steaming as archaeologists kneel in the dirt, the gleam of gold inlay catching light after centuries in darkness, the hush that falls over the team when the bee shape is noticed, each person leaning closer, silent in wonder. Outside the trench, the forest sways, the mist gathers, and bells from a distant village toll noon. It is as though time itself pauses, holding its breath, while the past rises quietly from the earth. The debated tension remains unresolved, but perhaps that is fitting. If these graves are indeed evidence of fugitives, knights or bloodlines carried north, they are not meant to shout their presence. They are meant to whisper, to survive only as echoes. To doubt them is rational. To feel their pull is human. And between doubt and desire lies the mist where stories live. The graves, the swords, the spirals, they remind us that history does not only live in parchment and chronicles, it also lives in the soil, in the artifacts that rust but do not vanish, in the carvings that fade but do not erase. The steel may dull, but the symbols endure, waiting for us to lean close, to listen. And so, stepping from these hybrid graves, we move onward in our journey. Ahead rise the Stave churches again, but this time paired with the great cathedrals of France and Scotland, where roses, bees, and spirals bloom not in earth, but in stone and glass. If the graves are the whispers of the dead, the churches are the voices of the living, still echoing centuries later. If the graves of Gotland are whispers from beneath the soil, then the Stave churches of Scandinavia are their echoes above ground. These wooden cathedrals rise like guardians in the forest, their tiered roofs stacked like dragon scales, their beams carved with interlacing forms of serpent and vine. They are at once deeply Norse and deeply Christian, built at the meeting of two faiths, two worlds. To step inside one is to enter not only a place of worship, but a hall of symbols, a conversation carved into timber. The fact is clear. Stave churches were built primarily in Norway between the 12th and 14th centuries. Their construction followed a pattern of upright posts, or staves, which gave them their name. Within their carvings, Christian crosses mingle with pagan motifs, sun wheels, dragon heads, knotwork patterns. They are physical embodiments of cultural transition, places where old gods and the new Christ seem to negotiate their boundaries. But within this mixture, some symbols stand out: spirals tucked into corners, rose-like patterns etched into doorframes, even bees carved discreetly into panels. The quirky detail comes from a church in Burgund, where visitors in the 19th century reported carvings of spirals so intricate they seemed to move in the flicker of candlelight. One traveler described them as spirits that coil like smoke, always returning to themselves. Whether the craftsman intended such an effect or not, the spirals resonated with those who had eyes trained to see them as part of a larger code. Another church at Urnes contains intertwining animal figures that, when viewed from a distance, resemble petals radiating outward, as though a rose were hidden within the knotwork. Was it accident, artistry, or message? The debated point lies in interpretation. Are these rose, bee, and spiral motifs true intrusions of foreign symbolism, perhaps carried north by Templar exiles or their allies, or are they simply part of the broader ornamental vocabulary of medieval Europe? Spirals, after all, are found in many traditions. Roses, too, can be decorative flourishes without deeper intent. Bees, though rarer, might have been copied from manuscripts or heraldry without conscious meaning. To argue that these symbols are Templar codes risks overreading, but to dismiss them entirely risks ignoring the possibility of intentionality. The Stave churches, in their dark wood and haunting silence, refuse to give us certainty. Now step with me inside Chartres Cathedral in France. The air is cool, heavy with incense. Sunlight filters through stained glass windows, one of which blooms into the famed rose window. A riot of colors, a wheel of petals in stone and glass. Below, upon the floor, lies the Labyrinth, a spiral-like path set into the paving stones. Pilgrims once walked it on their knees, a symbolic journey toward the center, toward God. And on some of the capitals, small carvings of bees are said to appear, though they are easy to overlook. Here in Chartres, rose, spiral, and bee unite, not in hidden wood, but in glorious stone. The resonance between Chartres and the Stave churches is striking. One is monumental, bathed in light, the pride of Gothic architecture. The other is intimate, dark, built of timber that creaks and breathes. Yet both contain echoes of the same triad of symbols. One wonders, was this coincidence, or was there a current of knowledge moving quietly beneath the surface of Europe, carried not only by merchants and monks, but by men dedicated to preserving memory through symbol? Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland offers yet another echo. Built in the 15th century, long after the Templars were suppressed, it contains carvings of spirals, roses, and even what some describe as beehives. The chapel has become a magnet for speculation, especially since the rise of popular books linking it to hidden orders and bloodlines. While some claims about Rosslyn stretch far beyond evidence, the density of symbolic carvings cannot be denied. To walk its aisles is to feel surrounded by a forest of stone, each surface etched with a message that hovers between sacred and secret. Imagine yourself standing inside one of these spaces. In Chartres, the bells toll above, their sound rolling like thunder through the nave. The light fractures into colors across your face, painting you with ruby and sapphire. You lower your eyes and see the spiral of the labyrinth at your feet, a path that seems to lead not outward but inward into the heart. In a Stave church, by contrast, the air is dim, scented with pine. Shadows move across beams where spirals and roses hide. The silence is thick, broken only by the groan of wood and the faint buzzing of a bee slipping in through a crack of sunlight. Two spaces, worlds apart in grandeur, yet bound by symbols that seem to whisper the same refrain. This interplay of architecture underscores an important point. Symbols migrate. They are not bound to one dynasty, one order, one faith. They flow like rivers, carried in manuscripts, in the hands of craftsmen, in the memories of exiles. To insist that every rose and stone is Merovingian, every spiral Templar, every bee a code, would be folly. Yet to see them align in certain places, across distances and centuries, invites us to wonder whether beneath the surface of trade and art lay a deeper current, a current of preservation. Perhaps these builders were not merely adorning wood and stone, but inscribing continuity. The sensory power of these places deepens the sense of continuity. In Chartres, one hears the clang of iron bells above, the murmur of prayers rising like mist. In Burgund, one hears the creak of beams, the soft knock of wood against wood as the wind moves the structure. In Rosslyn, one hears echoes of footsteps on stone, the hollow resonance of a chapel that feels both holy and hidden. Across them all runs a thread, symbols carved, etched, placed where eyes can see but minds must interpret. The debated heart of the matter remains unresolved. Were these churches and cathedrals linked by an intentional code, a way for hidden guardians of bloodlines or secrets to recognize one another? Or are we, centuries later, weaving a pattern where none existed, connecting dots that were never meant to form a picture? It is a tension that refuses closure. But perhaps that is the point. Perhaps the value lies not in certainty, but in the invitation to look closer, to notice what others pass by, to listen for the toll of bells within wood and stone. And so, from graves in Gotland to the cathedrals of France and the chapels of Scotland, the triad of rose, bee, and spiral continues to surface, sometimes bold, sometimes subtle, always lingering like a hum beneath the louder music of history. Whether by accident or design, they form a chain that refuses to break, linking disparate places into a tapestry of suggestion. From here, our path leads further still into the heart of the symbols themselves. It is time to pause and ask, what do rose, bee, and spiral mean? Why have they endured, resurfacing in graves, in wood, in glass, in stone? Are they mere decoration, or are they a code, a language of memory passed quietly across centuries? That question will guide us into the next chapter, where the triad itself takes center stage, the heartbeat of a hidden story. There are moments in history when three things come together to form a pattern so persistent that it feels less like coincidence and more like design. In the case of the Merovingians and their supposed northern echoes, that pattern is a triad: the rose, the bee, and the spiral. Each is simple enough on its own: a flower, an insect, a curve. Yet when woven together across centuries and across lands, they form a language of suggestion, a code that some believe carries the memory of a dynasty long thought extinguished. The fact is that all three symbols existed in medieval Europe with their own histories, The rose had long been a Christian emblem, associated with the Virgin Mary and with the blood of martyrs. Its petals adorned manuscripts, stained glass, and altars. The bee, though rarer, was famously linked to the Merovingian king Childeric III. When his tomb was opened in 1653, it yielded nearly 300 tiny golden bees, scattered like a swarm around his remains. They became emblems of industriousness, of immortality, and of renewal. And the spiral, present in Celtic art and Christian labyrinths alike, symbolized eternity, cycles, and the path of the soul. None of these symbols was unique to one culture or dynasty, but together they create an alignment that has tempted generations of interpreters. The quirky detail lies in Napoleon Bonaparte's fascination with Childeric's bees. When Childeric's tomb was unearthed in Tournai, the golden insects were taken as relics of an ancient kingship. 2 centuries later, Napoleon, eager to legitimize his own reign as a continuation of France's sacred monarchy, chose the bee as his personal emblem. He adorned his robes, his banners, and his coronation regalia with bees, rejecting the fleur-de-lis of the Bourbon dynasty. For him, the bee was not just a symbol of labor or nature, but a deliberate resurrection of Merovingian spirit. It was a way of saying, I too stand in a line of kings that stretches back to the long-haired rulers, to blood that is older than Carolingians or Capetians. The choice was eccentric, but powerful, reminding us that symbols, like seeds, can sprout centuries after being buried. The debated point is whether this triad, the rose, the bee, the spiral, was ever consciously used as a code of recognition, a hidden signature by those who preserved the Merovingian line, or the secrets entrusted to them. Skeptics argue that these are simply attractive symbols, widely available and widely used, and that to connect them is to weave coincidence into conspiracy. Believers insist that the recurrence of all three in combination across graves, churches, and chapels is too neat to dismiss. To them, the triad is a kind of whispered password, a sign that says, here, in this place, memory is kept. Imagine for a moment the sensory world of each symbol. The rose, blooming in stained glass, spills colored light onto the stone floors of cathedrals, its petals alive with ruby and sapphire hues. The bee, carved in gold, gleams against dark cloth, buzzing silently as a promise of renewal. The spiral, etched in stone or steel, draws the eye inward, luring it toward a center that seems always out of reach. To encounter all three in a single place is to feel surrounded by layers of meaning, as if the air itself hums with resonance. The rose carries with it the weight of both love and blood. In Christian art, it is often red, a reminder of sacrifice, the blood of Christ spilled for salvation. Yet in esoteric traditions, it also signifies secrecy. The phrase sub rosa, under the rose, was used to indicate that what was spoken beneath the flower's emblem was to remain secret. Thus, the rose becomes both sacred and hidden, a dual emblem of devotion and discretion. For a dynasty said to have slipped into shadows, this duality is striking. The bee, industrious and communal, represents not only fertility and life but also continuity. A hive is never about one bee, but about the swarm, the lineage, the collective memory. For the Merovingians, the bee's golden form may have symbolized their claim to eternal sovereignty, each insect a fragment of a larger crown. When Napoleon adopted it, he tapped into that sense of timeless continuity, bypassing dynasties that fell and reattaching himself to one that supposedly never truly died. The bee becomes not just an insect, but a torch, carrying flame across centuries. The spiral, perhaps the most enigmatic of the three, is not a static symbol, but a motion. It is a journey inward or outward, depending on how you trace it. In labyrinths such as the one at Chartres, it represented the soul's pilgrimage toward God, a slow, deliberate path that turned again and again until it reached the center. In Celtic and Norse art, the spiral evoked cycles of birth, death, and rebirth. To see it carved on a sword or a church beam is to be reminded of time's endless turning, of history repeating itself like the ringing of a distant bell. Now picture the triad together. A rose blooming at the heart of a spiral, its petals curling inward, bees hovering around it, buzzing as guardians of nectar. The image is almost hypnotic, as though it were designed not merely to decorate, but to embed itself in memory. If a group wished to preserve continuity and secrecy, such a triad would serve as a subtle but powerful code. It would not need to be shouted, only planted. Those who knew would see. Those who did not would simply admire the artistry. Skeptics may dismiss this as romantic fancy, but even they must admit the endurance of these symbols. They appear in places far removed from one another, sometimes centuries apart, yet still carrying resonance. In Rosslyn Chapel, spirals coil across the stone while roses bloom in corners. In Chartres, the rose window glows above the spiral labyrinth. In a Gotland grave, a bee rests upon a sword. Coincidence, perhaps, but a coincidence that hums like a bell in the mist. The sensory bridges between them deepen the feeling of connection. The rose appeals to the eye, the bee to the ear, the spiral to the touch of the mind. Together, they form a full-body symbol, one that engages vision, hearing, thought, and even imagination of scent, the fragrance of roses, the buzz of bees, the dizzying pull of a spiral. Such richness makes them unforgettable, makes them feel alive. The debated question will never be settled entirely. Did the Merovingians, or their supposed guardians, consciously craft this triad as a hidden emblem? Or are we, centuries later, spinning meaning from happenstance? The answer may rest not in proof, but in power. A symbol's truth is measured not only by its origin, but by its effect. And this triad has endured, shaping cathedrals, inspiring emperors, puzzling archaeologists, enchanting storytellers. It is a language without dictionary, but not without grammar. And so the rose, the bee, and the spiral remain with us. They toll like bells across time, steel softened by mist, ringing faintly in forest air. To trace them is to follow a thread that winds through graves and churches, through prophecy and legend, always circling back to the question of survival. If a dynasty were to slip into silence, these symbols could serve as its voice, whispering across generations. From here, our journey takes us even closer. We will look not only at the symbols themselves, but at how they are carved in detail, at the macro level. Bees in hexagons, roses with 5 petals, spirals that triple upon themselves. And in that closer look, we will pause for a moment. A gentle invitation to continue the exploration, to join in the act of noticing. There is a difference between seeing a symbol and beholding it. From a distance, a rose may appear as only a curve of lines, a bee as a dot with wings, a spiral as a careless loop. But draw closer, narrow the distance until the wood grain or stone texture presses against your vision, and suddenly, each symbol becomes something else entirely. Not just decoration, but a living pattern, intricate and insistent. In this section, we lean close, so close, that the world of symbols fills our sight like the petals of a flower pressed against the eye. The fact is that across medieval Europe, artisans worked in astonishing micro-detail. The rose window of Chartres is not just a flower, but a kaleidoscope of theology. Each petal filled with saints and stories, each shard of glass cut with precision. The labyrinth on the floor is not just a spiral, but a pilgrimage path, designed to be walked slowly, each step an act of devotion. At Rosslyn Chapel, spirals are not simply curves, but triple spirals. The ancient triskel, cut so finely into stone that even after centuries they appear almost alive, curling inward like shells of the sea. And in Scandinavia's stave churches, bees and roses appear not as bold declarations but as small, tucked-away details, as if they were whispers carved into beams for those who would bother to lean close. The quirky detail here is that in some manuscripts, bees are drawn within hexagons, perfectly nested, like the cells of a hive. These hexagons are sometimes mistaken for simple geometry, but when placed alongside a bee figure, they become unmistakable. The hive itself is a marvel. Every cell identical, each angle perfect, a pattern so precise that mathematicians still marvel at its efficiency. To find such hexagonal motifs in medieval art, sometimes in the margins of manuscripts, sometimes tucked into carvings, suggests that the artisans were fascinated not only by bees themselves, but by the order they represented. To carve a bee is to speak of life. To carve a hive is to speak of structure, of community, of memory preserved. The debated point lies in the question of overfitting, whether modern interpreters, hungry for mystery, impose too much meaning upon these details. Is a spiral always a symbol of eternity, or could it sometimes just be a flourish of style, a mason enjoying the curve of his chisel? Is every rose a code of secrecy, or could some be no more than a flower carved to brighten a lintel? The danger of interpretation is that it can inflate decoration into declaration. Yet the density of such motifs, especially when rose, bee, and spiral cluster together, makes coincidence harder to accept. The line between artistry and code remains blurred, but it is that very blur that keeps us peering closer. Imagine now the sensory act of leaning toward a carving. Your breath fogs the wood. The grain rises beneath your fingers, ridged and rough where the chisel cut centuries earlier. The spiral moves beneath your gaze, coiling inward until your vision blurs, and you feel as though you are falling into it. A rose carved in stone blooms in shadow, its petals soft despite their hardness, catching faint beams of light that shift with the hour. A bee, no larger than a fingernail, hovers eternally on a beam, its wings stretched as if mid-flight. The closer you look, the more the details multiply, until you feel less as though you are studying them, and more as though they are studying you. It is here, in this closeness, that symbols reveal their power. From afar, they blend into the architecture. Up close, they whisper. The spiral says all things return. The rose says beauty hides meaning. The bee says memory survives in community. Together, they hum like a chord struck on an unseen instrument. And so we pause here at the macro level with an invitation. If you, dear listener, feel drawn into these details, you are not alone. Countless eyes before yours have lingered on them. Some saw decoration, Some saw devotion, some saw code. The beauty of symbols is that they allow multiple readings without losing their essence. They belong both to the mason who carved them and to the wanderer who notices them centuries later. Now let us step gently into the realm of speculation. If the Templars, fleeing persecution, sought to mark safe places, would they not choose symbols that already carried layers of meaning, hiding in plain sight? A spiral could be both art and sign. A rose could be both Christian emblem and esoteric code. A bee could be both natural charm and dynastic echo. Together, they could serve as a recognition system, obvious to none, but legible to those who knew. That possibility, however uncertain, gives these small details a weight far greater than their size. The sensory immersion deepens if you imagine not only seeing, but tracing. Run your finger over the spiral cut into stone. The curve pulls you inward, slowly, endlessly. Rest your hand upon the rose window, the glass cool under your palm, light vibrating through it like the pulse of a heart. Place your fingertip on the tiny bee and feel the bump where the wing was carved. It is not only sight that draws us in, but touch, the act of contact across time. These artisans may not have known your name, but they carved for you nonetheless, for eyes and hands centuries later, for hearts willing to listen. The debated point returns again. Is this wishful thinking, or is it genuine continuity? To some, the notion of coded carvings smuggled across centuries by fugitive knights sounds like the stuff of novels. To others, it is the most natural thing in the world. History has always been carried in whispers, in hidden scripts, in subtle signs left for those who would inherit them. Perhaps we will never prove intention, but perhaps proof is not the point. The point is resonance, the way a spiral pulls you, the way a rose blooms, the way a bee hums. Symbols endure because they mean more than one thing, because they invite interpretation rather than demand it. And so, as we draw close to these carvings, as we linger on them with eyes and fingers, we also pause to extend a soft invitation. If this journey has stirred your curiosity, if you wish to see more of these symbols at work, at Chartres, at Gotland, at Rosslyn, then stay with us for the next part of this exploration. Like the spiral itself, the journey winds inward, always revealing more, the closer we come. For now, we step back slightly, letting the rose, the bee, and the spiral blur again into architecture. They will remain where they are, quiet guardians of memory. Ahead of us lies a moment of reckoning, when we attempt to distinguish fact from speculation, to place our findings in a framework that respects both history and wonder. But before we move, let the symbols rest in your sight, humming faintly, like a bell in mist. History often feels like a table laid with two columns. On one side sit the facts, names, dates, objects cataloged and measured, evidence that withstands the scrutiny of scholars. On the other side sit the speculations, whispers, legends, possibilities that cannot be proven, but also cannot be silenced. Between these two columns stretches the empty space where imagination resides, where we lean across from one side to the other, trying to bridge the gap. In the case of the Merovingians and their supposed northern refuge, this table of fact and speculation becomes our most useful lens. Let us set the first column, the fact of Dagobert II's death in 679. The chronicles are clear enough. He was assassinated in the Vosges Mountains, struck with a spear while hunting. That is fact. In the second column lies speculation, that his bloodline survived in secrecy, perhaps spirited away, perhaps preserved by loyal guardians. The evidence is thin, but the whispers remain. Between the two columns lies the question, is assassination an ending, or is it only the beginning of silence? Next, the fact of Childeric III's deposition in 751. His hair was cut, his kingship dissolved, Pepin the Short crowned with papal blessing. This is documented, attested, undeniable. And yet, speculation insists that the act was not the true end. Hair grows back. Bloodlines scatter but do not evaporate. Somewhere, say the whispers, the Merovingian blood continued, unthroned but unbroken. Between the two columns, we wonder, can scissors cut away destiny, or only its surface? Then, the fact of October 1307. The Templars were arrested en masse on the orders of Philip IV. Leaders were tortured, confessions extracted, the order condemned. That is fact. In the second column lies the speculation of the fleet at La Rochelle, vanished into the mist. Did ships truly slip away into the night? Did they carry treasure, relics, even bloodlines? No proof exists, only stories. Yet the absence itself is loud. Between the two columns we feel the tension, steel chains and parchment records on one side, sails and fog on the other. Move next to the fact of Gotland's graves. Archaeologists have found swords with unusual markings, roses, spirals, even bees. These objects exist, catalogued and photographed, but speculation fills the second column, suggesting that these were not mere decorations, but deliberate symbols, codes left by exiles or guardians. The truth could be trade, could be coincidence, or could be continuity. Between the two columns lies the silence of the grave, impossible to question, impossible to answer. And what of the Stave churches? Fact tells us they stand, built of timber in the 12th to 14th centuries, carved with dragons, crosses, knotwork. Their existence is undeniable. Speculation points to bees carved in panels, spirals etched in beams, roses hidden in knotwork. Were these signs intentional, or were they simply artistry? Between the two columns, the church itself creaks like a ship, its wood speaking in groans we cannot fully interpret. At Chartres, the rose window and the labyrinth are fact. They stand, visited by thousands, photographed endlessly. Their beauty needs no invention. Speculation adds that their alignment with Merovingian symbols, the rose, the spiral, was not coincidence, but code, a language of continuity. Between the columns, the cathedral hums with mystery, sunlight turning glass into prophecy. Rosslyn Chapel, too, stands in both columns. Fact. It was built in the 15th century, long after the suppression of the Templars. Its carvings are real, dense, ornate. Speculation. Those carvings conceal codes, spirals, roses, bees, placed as signs for those who knew. Between the columns, Rosslyn becomes a labyrinth of interpretation, each visitor tracing their own spiral of meaning. It is tempting to want one column without the other. Scholars lean on fact, sweeping speculation aside as distraction. Dreamers lean on speculation, dismissing fact as a cage. But in truth, history is richest when both columns stand together. Fact gives us the bones. Speculation gives us the flesh. Without fact, speculation drifts like mist without anchor. Without speculation, fact lies silent, like a skeleton without voice. The quirky detail here is that even medieval scribes played with this duality. Margins of manuscripts often contain factual glosses, clarifications, translations, but also doodles, jokes, and cryptic lines, like the so-called Northern Prophecy. For the scribe, fact and speculation were not enemies, but neighbors, sharing the same page. Perhaps we too must allow them to coexist, side by side, each illuminating the other. The debated point, then, is not whether speculation should exist, it always will, but whether speculation should be treated as history or as story. Some argue that to blur them is dangerous, to turn legend into supposed fact. Others argue that story itself has a kind of truth, even if not empirical, for it reveals what people longed to believe, what they feared, what they remembered in whispers. Perhaps the Merovingian myths are less about what literally happened and more about what Europe needed to imagine. That no dynasty truly dies, that kings only sleep, that memory is preserved in symbol. Imagine now a table in a dim library, a great oak slab with 2 columns drawn upon it. On the left, parchments neatly stacked, dates written in firm hand. On the right, loose scraps, scribbles, sketches of bees and roses, lines of prophecy. Between them, a candle burns, its flame flickering, throwing light and shadow across both sides. You sit there, looking from one column to the other, knowing you will never fuse them completely. Yet the act of looking, of comparing, brings a strange peace, both fact and speculation told together, like 2 bells whose tones overlap, steel and mist ringing in harmony. And here, dear listener, we extend a soft invitation. If you have walked with us this far, tracing both fact and speculation, perhaps you might share which column draws you most. Do you lean toward the bones of history, the certainties of date and artifact? Or do you lean toward the flesh of legend, the allure of symbols and whispers? Your answer shapes the journey as much as mine. For as we step forward, we leave the table of 2 columns and enter the field of folklore itself, the songs, the stories, the local legends that carry bees, roses, and spirals into the mouths of villagers and singers. These are not facts at all, but they hum with memory, and they will carry us deeper into the forest of history, where bells toll faintly and kings perhaps still whisper in sleep. If facts are stones and documents, and speculation is the mist that swirls around them, then folklore is the forest itself, alive, rustling, filled with voices that refuse to be pinned down. It is in folklore that symbols escape the scholar's hand and live in the mouths of villagers, in songs, in riddles told around fires. And in the northern lands where whispers of the Merovingian bloodline supposedly linger, folklore gives us some of the most haunting images of all: the red bee king, the empty crown, the golden swarm that hums beneath the snow. The fact that underpins this folklore is the archaeological discovery of Childeric III's tomb in Tournai in 1653. Among the weapons, jewels, and signet rings, excavators found nearly 300 tiny golden bees or cicadas, scattered like a swarm around the burial. They became instantly associated with Merovingian kingship. For historians, they were grave goods, symbolic perhaps of immortality or rebirth. For storytellers, they were proof that the kings of the Franks had carried bees as their emblem, guardians of a sacred hive. From that fact grew countless tales, some rooted in scholarship, others in imagination. The quirky detail is how Napoleon seized upon those bees. Centuries after their burial, and long after the Merovingians had been deposed, Napoleon Bonaparte adopted the golden bee as his personal emblem. Rejecting the fleur-de-lis of the Bourbon dynasty, he cloaked himself in swarms of bees, weaving them into his robes, his banners, even his coronation mantle. It was a deliberate act of appropriation, to bind himself to the first dynasty of France, to claim continuity with kings whose power was said to flow from myth and mystery. To Napoleon, the bees were not just insects, but a bridge across time, a swarm of legitimacy buzzing around his throne. From here, folklore takes flight. In the far north, storytellers speak of the Red Bee King, a figure with hair like fire and a crown of humming bees. He is said to wander beneath the glaciers, his swarm preserving him in a hive of ice, waiting for the day he will emerge. Children in certain Icelandic sagas were told that if they listened closely to the crackling of ice, they might hear the faint buzzing of his bees, as though the glacier itself were alive. Was this a distorted memory of Childeric's golden bees, retold in northern tongues? Or was it an independent invention, bees chosen simply because they are strange, industrious creatures? The debated point is whether these folklore motifs truly preserve echoes of Merovingian legacy, or whether they are simply the universal play of imagination. Folklore everywhere produces sleeping kings: Arthur in Avalon, Charlemagne in a mountain, Frederick Barbarossa waiting in a cave. To add a Red Bee King to the list may not require any historical connection at all. Yet the convergence of bee imagery with actual Merovingian finds tempts us to wonder, are these tales not just invention, but distorted echoes of a truth that traveled north with exiles, carried in stories as much as in symbols? Imagine the sensory world of such folklore. The fire crackles in a wooden hall, shadows dancing on beams. Children gather close, their eyes wide, as an elder tells of the Red Bee King. His crown hums, not with jewels, but with wings. His beard drips honey that never hardens. His warriors, too, wear bees upon their helms, and when they march, the sound is not of footsteps, but of buzzing. Outside, the wind rattles the door, and in that moment, the line between story and reality blurs. The children will remember the tale, pass it to their children, and so the swarm of legend continues to hum across generations. Other northern tales speak of the empty crown. A golden diadem is said to lie buried beneath a lake, guarded by bees that hover upon its surface. The crown cannot be lifted unless the rightful heir returns, a man of long hair and southern blood. Until then, the bees sting any who reach for it, driving them away. Such tales bear the structure of folklore everywhere: the hidden treasure, the rightful king. But the presence of bees, once again, is striking. Why bees unless they carried some deeper resonance, some memory older than the storytellers themselves? Still other accounts from Sami traditions describe songs of humming guardians, spirits that hover above graves in swarms, protecting the dead. Whether these were literal bees or metaphorical ones is unclear, but when placed beside the golden insects of Childeric's tomb, the resonance is haunting. It is as if the bee, that most communal of creatures, became the chosen metaphor across cultures for memory, protection, and continuity. Skeptics remind us that bees are not so unusual in symbolism. They represent diligence, fertility, immortality. Any culture could embrace them without borrowing from the Merovingians. And yet, the overlap persists. golden bees in France, a red bee king in Iceland, humming guardians and Sami songs, bees on Norwegian carvings. At some point, coincidence begins to hum like intention. The sensory quality of these legends makes them powerful. The buzzing of bees is not like other sounds. It is constant, vibrating, almost hypnotic. To imagine a king preserved by bees is to imagine immortality humming around him, life embodied in sound. To imagine a crown guarded by bees is to imagine power that cannot be seized by force, only by belonging. The bee becomes not only a symbol, but an atmosphere, an experience, a hum that fills both ear and heart. And so the folklore of the Red Bee King joins our table of echoes. It is not fact, though it may rest on fact. It is not speculation, though it may mingle with it. It is a story, and stories often hold truths deeper than documents. The Red Bee King may never have lived, but his bees hum still, in wood, in stone, in the cracks of glaciers. As we leave the realm of folklore, the hum of bees lingers in the air, mingling with the toll of bells and the creak of forests. Ahead of us lies the final descent of our journey, to ask whether all these echoes, prophecy, graves, churches, folklore, point toward continuity or only toward silence. For silence itself, as we shall see, may be the strongest vault of all. Silence can be as heavy as stone. It fills chambers, cloisters, and caverns with an invisible weight, pressing upon the ears until every whisper, every sigh of wind becomes amplified. In the story of the Merovingians and their supposed survival, silence itself has often been described as the final vault, the stronghold in which their memory rests. Not a vault of gold or iron, but of absence, of secrecy, of things not said. The fact is that when dynasties fall, their traces often grow faint. Documents are lost, destroyed, or rewritten to favor the victors. The Merovingians, after Pepin's coup in 751, were treated as relics of a bygone age. Childeric III was tonsured and placed in a monastery, his line declared extinguished. The Carolingians, and later the Capetians, had no interest in preserving the aura of long-haired kings. Silence fell, because silence was convenient. It erased the awkwardness of a dynasty that still carried mythical weight. It is a silence one can see in the scarcity of surviving records, the gaps in chronicles, the absence of genealogies. The Merovingians had not simply fallen, they had been buried in silence. The quirky detail is how this silence, intended as erasure, instead became a kind of protection. In 1653, when Childeric II's tomb was discovered in Tournai, it was as though the silence had cracked. Golden bees, weapons, and jewels emerged from the earth, preserved by centuries of obscurity. Had the tomb been remembered, it might have been looted long before. But forgotten, it became a time capsule. Its silence the very reason it survived. The same is true of symbols carved in stave churches or inscribed upon stones. Forgotten meanings allowed them to endure unnoticed. Silence is often the best lock, one that thieves and inquisitors alike cannot break. The debated point is whether this silence was merely the natural erosion of memory or whether it was cultivated deliberately. Did the Church, by emphasizing Carolingian legitimacy, choose to smother the Merovingians under layers of forgetfulness? Did chroniclers, by omission, become participants in a campaign of silence? Or did loyalists of the old dynasty themselves choose secrecy, hiding their memory in symbols and folklore, rather than in open record, trusting silence to guard what speech could not? The difference is crucial. Silence as neglect is one thing. Silence as strategy is quite another. Imagine the sensory reality of such silence. In a monastery cloister, the bells toll, but between them stretches long quiet. Monks walk with lowered eyes, their sandals brushing softly against stone. In one cell, a monk writes, his quill scratching faintly. He records kings and battles of recent years, but he skips certain names, certain stories. He pauses, as though tempted to include them, then closes his ink pot. Silence fills the page where words could have been. Elsewhere, in a forest, a stone lies with a spiral carved upon it. Snow gathers on the grooves. No one asks what it means. The silence around it protects it, allowing it to wait. This silence functions almost like a vault, steel bars made of absence, mist thick enough to conceal. Unlike treasure hoards or relics locked in castles, what is placed in silence cannot be easily seized. It lives in folklore, in carvings, in whispers. To those who do not know, it is invisible. To those who do, it is indestructible. In this sense, silence becomes the most enduring protection of all. The Vault of Silence also explains why the Merovingian story refuses to die. Silence is never complete. It leaves space for echoes, and echoes invite interpretation. When a chronicle skips a detail, imagination fills it in. When a tomb is forgotten, its rediscovery becomes a revelation. When symbols lie unremarked, they eventually shimmer for those who notice them. Silence is not emptiness. It is potential, a field where memory sleeps until called awake. One might even say that the Merovingian legacy has always thrived on silence. Their mythical founder, Merovec, was said to be born of a sea creature, an origin shrouded in ambiguity. Clovis's baptism was recorded in miracle-laden tones, but details blur upon inspection. Dagobert's death left room for rumors of hidden heirs. The last king's hair was cut, but silence followed as to what became of him. At every stage, gaps and silences have nourished the story as much as facts. Like a spiral, the dynasty seems to disappear only to return again, turning endlessly in and out of view. Picture now the metaphor of the vault itself, a stone chamber underground, air heavy and still. Bees hum faintly in the dark, golden but unseen. A crown rests upon a pedestal, its outline barely visible. No door, no lock, only silence holds it in place. The vault does not need guards. It needs only forgetfulness. And forgetfulness, unlike guards, never grows tired. The quirky irony is that silence also attracts seekers. Just as a locked chest makes us wonder what is inside, a silence makes us wonder what is missing. The lack of evidence becomes its own kind of evidence. Why would it be so quiet, we ask, unless something important was being hidden? Thus, silence feeds speculation, and speculation keeps the story alive. The Merovingians, in this way, may be the dynasty most preserved by absence. They are remembered precisely because they are forgotten. The debated question that lingers is whether silence can truly preserve forever. Eventually, tombs crack, manuscripts surface, stones erode. The vault opens, whether intended or not. Perhaps this is the fate of all silences. They hold as long as they can, but in the end, something slips through. A bee escapes. A spiral catches the eye. A line of prophecy is noticed in a margin. And when it does, we who stand centuries later feel as though we have stumbled upon a secret, even if it was always waiting to be found. And so silence becomes not merely absence but presence, a participant in history. The Merovingians live on not because their line can be traced cleanly, but because silence gave them room to haunt imagination. Silence became their steel, their mist, their forest. As we move from this vault, we arrive at the threshold of our journey's close. Ahead lies the final wind down, when the toll of bells softens, when the steel of history fades into the mist of sleep. There we will leave the Merovingians, not as kings upon thrones, but as whispers preserved by silence, a lullaby carved into stone and snow. The journey we have walked together has been long, winding as a spiral carved in stone. We have passed through forests of timber churches, along harbors where ships vanished into mist, across graves where bees, roses, and spirals waited in silence. We have listened to bells tolling in cathedrals and to the hum of folklore buzzing around fires. And now, as we reach the final section, the time comes not for new revelations, but for rest. The fact that remains steady and unshakable is that the Merovingian dynasty ended in 751 when Childeric III was deposed, and Pepin the Short claimed the throne. That event is written in chronicles, attested by documents, undeniable in the flow of history. The line of long-haired kings lost its crown, its scissors cutting not just hair but destiny. That is the foundation stone upon which all else is built. The quirky detail, however, is that dynasties never vanish so neatly in the human imagination. Where fact ends, story begins. In 1653, when Childeric III's tomb yielded its golden bees, people saw not only grave goods, but symbols of continuity, emblems that Napoleon himself would later adopt to legitimize his reign. The bees, once silent, began to hum again, centuries after being buried. A dynasty supposedly ended continued to breathe through symbols, adopted, adapted, transformed. And the debated point is whether that continuity has any basis in flesh and blood, or whether it lives only in symbol and story. Were there hidden heirs carried north by guardians, preserved in silence, or was the line extinguished, in fact, preserved only in whispers that spread like pollen through folklore and architecture? Historians argue, skeptics dismiss, dreamers insist. The vault of silence has never opened fully, leaving us to wonder whether the crown is lost or only asleep. Now, as the hour grows late, let us step back from argument and listen instead to the rhythm of history as though it were a lullaby. Imagine the bells of Chartres tolling in the distance, their notes softening with each strike until they blur into silence. Imagine the forests of Norway, mist rising between the trees, stave churches creaking like ships in the wind. Imagine Gotland's shores, waves lapping quietly against stones where spirals have been carved. Steel lies buried, rusted. Bees hum faintly in the air. Roses bloom unseen in shadowed corners. Everything slows. In this quiet, the Merovingians are no longer kings or claimants. They are stories, preserved not in crowns, but in symbols. The rose blooms endlessly, its petals unfolding in glass and stone. The bee hums, tireless, industrious, carrying memory like pollen from one generation to the next. The spiral turns inward, leading us toward rest, reminding us that all journeys, however long, circle back to silence. These three together form not a code to be cracked, but a lullaby to be heard, a harmony of image and sound that carries us gently into sleep. Picture once more the northern prophecy, scribbled in the margin of a saga. When the blood of the southern kings meets the sleep of the ice, the crown shall rise again, cold but unbroken. Perhaps it is authentic. Perhaps it is invention. Either way, its words serve as poetry, a reminder that even in silence, memory stirs. The crown does not glitter in gold. It glimmers in thought, in imagination, in the shared act of remembering. That crown cannot be shorn, cannot be exiled, cannot be burned. It belongs not to kings, but to the quiet of history itself. The sensory imagery deepens now, soft and slow. The steel of swords has dulled, their edges lost to rust. The bells that once rang in triumph or alarm toll gently, fading into distance. Mist gathers, wrapping the world in quiet. In a dark forest, a rose blooms unseen, its fragrance drifting faintly. A bee hums in the cool air, circling slowly before settling into stillness. A spiral etched in stone glimmers under moonlight, its lines leading inward, always inward toward peace. The world exhales, and with it, so do we. The quirky charm of history is that it rarely closes its stories cleanly. The Merovingians ended, yet they linger. The Templars vanished, yet they echo. Silence itself became the greatest vault, preserving memory not by declaration, but by absence. And here, in this final lull, we realize that perhaps that is the truest legacy of all. Not proof, not lineage, but atmosphere, the hum of bees, the toll of bells, the mist of forests, the curve of spirals. Symbols live longer than kings. They whisper long after crowns have fallen. The debated conclusion is whether that whisper matters. Does it change the course of history if a bloodline survived in secret? Perhaps not. Yet it matters because it shows us how humans remember, how we weave fact and story into tapestries that endure. The Merovingians lived not in genealogies, but in imagination, in symbols that hum beneath the conscious mind, like a lullaby. They live because we dream them, because we listen to silence and call it memory. And now, at the end of this long wandering, we allow the spiral to close. We have circled around kings and prophecies, ships and graves, bees and roses, but the path has always been leading here, to stillness, to rest, to sleep. The steel has softened, the bells have grown faint, the mist has gathered, the forest is quiet. So let the crown rest, whether lost or sleeping. Let the bees return to their hive. Let the rose close its petals for the night. Let the spiral draw inward, carrying us with it, slowly, gently, inevitably, into silence. Good night, dear listener. May the hum of bees, the toll of bells, the mist of forests, and the turning of spirals carry you softly into dreams.